MichaelBtheGameGenie here, and today on Game Genie Review, we're going to be taking a look at absolutely my favorite Arcade1Up cabinet, Atari Star Wars. We're also going to be installing and reviewing the Glen's retro show, Flight Yoke. Today's review is long overdue, as we will finally be taking a look at what is possibly the best made Arcade1Up cabinet to date, Atari Star Wars. I wasn't going to review this cabinet initially because it's been on the market for so long already, but I promised a very good friend of mine by the name of EdT1138 that I would review it for him. Plus, I'm extremely interested in checking out the Glen's retro show, Flight Yoke. Glen was kind enough to send me a copy of the Yoke for review, so let's take a look at this awesome cabinet and see if the Glen's retro show, Flight Yoke, can improve the experience. I think one of the dream cabinets for just about everybody when Arcade1Up came out was Atari Star Wars, as it's just such an iconic arcade cabinet for arguably the biggest movie franchise of all time. However, because of that, no one thought they could pull off the license. Even if they could do the impossible and get the license, how would they be able to capture the look and feel of the original cabinet? And even more complex was recreating a Flight Yoke controller that has the real feel arcade controls while remaining cost effective. Somehow, Arcade1Up pulled off not just the impossible, but the impossible hat trick, as they not only released Atari Star Wars into their lineup, but they did it in style with proper controls and at a very reasonable price point. The very first thing we need to talk about with the cabinet is the form factor, as this was the very first Arcade1Up cabinet to not have the same shape that we have come to expect from this company. For this iconic cabinet, they literally broke the mold by recreating the distinct shape of the side panels from the original arcade. This has a direct effect in two areas, as for the first time the control panel now sits inside the cabinet as opposed to over the side panels themselves, and the marquee is actually on an angle to match the slope of the top of the panel. The big reason, of course, for them changing the side panels for the first time was to try and match the shape of the original cabinet, but also to display the artwork from the original cabinet correctly, and boy am I ever glad they did, because this is beyond beautiful. The attention to detail Arcade1Up paid to this cabinet's artwork is near perfect, and they paid total respect to arcade enthusiasts and of course Star Wars fans who could only dream of one day seeing this arcade in their house. Everything is there, from the visage of Darth Vader to the TIE fighters and X-Wings fighting over the Death Star, and it all just looks so good. This is all outlined with a really nice blue trim around the cabinet, acting as a T-molding that really makes the cabinet pop. The marquee is stunning and is still one of the very best looking light up marquees from Arcade1Up. This was the very first cabinet I received with a light up marquee, and I'm not going to lie, that added feature was one of the things that drew me so heavily to purchasing this cabinet. People tend to be critical of the Arcade1Up marquees and are very loyal to the quality from their favorite third-party sellers, but I have never heard a single complaint specifically about the Star Wars marquee. There are no hotspots, no areas where the marquee gets washed out, and it just looks amazing. The whole front area is very interesting with this cabinet, and I am not just talking about the unique controller. If you take a look at the bezel around the screen, the first thing you will notice is that, strangely, this has zero Arcade1Up branding on the bezel. You will also notice that it has a weird design that looks like it's trying to recreate a 3D shape. On the original cabinet, the sides of the marquee and the control panel had these raised 3D sections to make it look like a cockpit that there was no way Arcade1Up could sensibly recreate and flat pack, so we got this artwork on the bezel that I am totally fine with. The screen itself is a beautiful BOE monitor like everything else from Arcade1Up during and after Wave 3, and we all know the level of quality with these monitors. What's interesting is that 2 of the 3 games that come on this cabinet are actually vector graphics, and it's extremely interesting to see vector graphics emulated. Thankfully, the emulation for this cabinet was handled by Code Mystics, and the vector emulation is done so well. There are instances where you are hit at times in the game, the screen will cut out for an instant gray, which some people were critical of, but as it turns out, that is something that happens on the actual cabinet as well, and that is the level of detail Code Mystics went to. Honestly, nothing beats a real vector screen, but this looks about as good as it could possibly look. They have also included options to adjust the vector graphics on some games so it looks like you want it to look, but honestly, I just leave it standard. On the one game that doesn't use vector graphics, Return of the Jedi, the colors look great, and it even includes an option to add scan lines. The front section of the cabinet, or kick plate, is typically just a black section that displays the logos of the included games, but this one is more the same and different. While it still does include the logos of the included games, it also has an artistic background that matches the art design behind the coin door on the original cabinet. Another example of the crazy level of attention to detail displayed by Arcade1Up on this cabinet. This cabinet is also the tallest Arcade1Up cabinet, standing approximately 3 inches taller than all other Arcade1Up cabinets. The reason why is that the included riser actually lifts your cabinet up 15 inches as opposed to the standard 12. The reason why is the slope of the control panel, which we will come back to in a second. One last word on the riser. Man, it is pretty and even looks great despite using a different colored trim. Well, now let's talk about the control panel, and of course the elephant in the room, the flight yoke. They once again did a great job recreating the aesthetic and feel of the original cabinet here, as it looks like it should and is on the appropriate angle for the yoke to be played properly. This is also why they included the additional 3 inches on the riser, as instead of sacrificing that slope, they lifted up the cab an additional few inches to ensure the appropriate control height consistent with the rest of their cabs. Of course, there is the yoke itself, which is all plastic, and well, it actually feels pretty great. Honestly, I had seen so many people concerned with what the quality of the yoke would be like prior to launch, and everybody has been pretty happy with it. Sure, it doesn't have the same solid feel of the original yoke, and you can tell it's plastic, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't control pretty great. It has the right responsiveness to control the games like they should, and the tensions all seem appropriate. I don't have a ton of experience playing this one in the arcade, so I can't say how it compares to the original, but from my limited time, it feels good to me. My only concern, honestly, is how it will hold up over the long haul, as during some intense sessions, I get pretty rough with it to try and will my score a little higher. The cabinet comes with 3 games: Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, which were the popular titles, and one, a little more likely you don't remember, Return of the Jedi. Star Wars is just an absolute treat to play. I was really concerned that I wouldn't appreciate Star Wars Arcade when I was buying this cab, because it was a little outside my personal arcade nostalgia, as I started going more towards the late 80s and early 90s. I am, however, a huge Star Wars fan, and so is my wife, plus the reviews made it look like so much fun. I started playing it and immediately fell in love. For those not familiar, the wireframe vector graphics look incredibly basic, probably, and maybe that doesn't impress you. The game itself is a loop of the same levels over and over again, with slight changes and no real end in sight as you keep playing to improve your score. You may be thinking this game isn't that great, and that was my concern heading into it, but let me tell you, when you put yourself in front of this machine, you hear those Star Wars sounds and see the bright vector graphics coming at you, and you feel yourself move through the incredible flight yoke. You are transported to a different place, and this game takes a hold of you hard. Honestly, this became absolutely one of my favorite games of all time, really quick, and honestly completely changed my perspective on arcade games and made me a score chaser fan. In conclusion, it's literally awesome. Empire Strikes Back is actually just more than the first game, slightly modified. If I'm not mistaken, I believe Empire Strikes Back was a conversion kit for the original arcade cabinet. You get more wireframe graphics and new stages and enemies from the movie to challenge against. I've always been a huge sucker for the Battle of Hoth in games, so flying through the walkers and shooting them with tow cables is a real treat. While this is an updated version of the original game and it offers so many features, I strangely still prefer the original game. There is just something about the simplicity of its challenge. Don't get me wrong, this game is still fantastic, and if I can ever master the first game, I may spend more time with this one. Return of the Jedi is kind of the wacky stepchild here, as it moves away from the format the first 2 games put in place. It still uses the Flight Yoke controller, but it is a completely different game. Instead of the vector, semi-realistic worlds, you are instead looking at an isometric landscape with very small characters controlling different vehicles in stages from the movie. I've always had some crazy depth perception issues with isometric games and have such a hard time following the action, so I am not good at this game, but I can't say it also isn't fun. It's a blast to play. It's clearly the worst game on this arcade, but it also provides some variety to do something different, and that is always a good thing with these cabinets. Last but not least, I have to give Cove Mystics such amazing credit here on the fantastic job they did with making sure the emulation experience on these games was top notch. This is the first time we have been given an options menu on a cabinet. The option menu allows us to adjust the gameplay experience to our desires and add in awesome features like scan lines and of course adjust the vector brightness with the first two games. Cove Mystics, you did such a good job, and your partnership with Arcade1Up here has easily made their most impressive cabinet to date. Yeah, I think it's pretty safe to say that I'm absolutely in love with the Arcade1Up Atari Star Wars cabinet. If you're a big Star Wars fan, or you just want to pick up an awesome Arcade1Up cabinet, and you can find one that's still available for purchase, I can't recommend highly enough picking up this cabinet. Well, if I'm such a big fan of Atari Star Wars by Arcade1Up, why do I want to replace the Flight Yoke? Let's be clear here, you totally don't have to. The stock yoke is pretty great, but I'm such a big fan of the Glen's Retro Show products, and after modding my Arcade1Up Centipede cabinet with his trackball and seeing how that improved that experience, I couldn't wait to get my hands on the Flight Yoke and see how that would improve this awesome cabinet. Anybody who knows me knows that I am not a technical modding guy, so right off the bat, if I can install this, anyone can. The Glen's Retro Show Flight Yoke comes packed pretty well with everything you will need to install this Flight Yoke to the device of your choosing. I say device of your choosing because it comes with wire connectors ready to go from everything from Arcade1Up to a USB. I picked this up from my Arcade1Up, so that is what we were going to focus on today. First thing, let's turn off the power to our Star Wars Arcade1Up so we can unscrew the control panel from the cabinet and disconnect the ribbon cable connecting it to the PCB. The next step is removing the plastic covering under the control panel, and pro tip, make sure you watch where all the little screws go when taking this thing off. First thing you will want to do is take out the wires connecting the Flight Yoke to the control panel. Problem is, they are not only plugged in, but glued in, so we will need to break out the trusty hairdryer to loosen up the glue so we can safely unplug the cables. This is a little tricky to get off as we have 4 screws on top under the yoke that connect the top plate to the one underneath, which you will need to loosen and unscrew the bolts from underneath. Next, there are 2 screws underneath that need to be unscrewed. Once done, separate the plates and we can remove the Flight Yoke. Now we take the Glen's Retro Show Flight Yoke out of the box, and first thing you will notice is, boy, is this thing ever heavy. The main base itself is made of metal and incredibly solid. The yoke handles on the left and right sides are still plastic but feel great and sturdy. Like I mentioned earlier, the Flight Yoke controller has a gaggle of connectors coming out of the bottom, so we carefully thread those through the hole on the control panel and then the provided hole on the bottom plate. Next, we need to screw in the 4 screws on the top plate under the yoke through the control deck and through the bottom plate. This is a little tricky because of how heavy the yoke is, and we have to keep it turned while we get all the screws through and tighten the bolts underneath. When all 4 are tightened, we then re-plug in the 5 matching connector cable plugs to the ones we removed from the original yoke. Once everything is connected, we can screw the bottom back on after stuffing all those wires and connectors in the plastic casing. Reconnect our ribbon cable and screw the control deck back in place, and we are ready to play some Star Wars. One look at the GRS yoke on the cabinet and it looks great, but there are 2 distinct cosmetic changes you can notice right away. The first one, of course, is the yoke is actually slightly more raised off the control deck with a 1-inch gap between the yoke bottom and the deck. Oh, and of course the Atari logo isn't on the yoke. I'm gonna be honest, that really bums me out. I completely get why Glen couldn't have included it here, but I am absolutely going to be buying a sticker or something to replace the missing Atari symbol. If you aren't as anal about it as I am, I mean, it looks great, and Glen did an amazing job recreating the art from the original yoke. It's just missing the symbol, which was completely out of his control. Of course, you aren't replacing the yoke for its looks. You want to know how it feels, and more importantly, does it improve gameplay, right? Well, it feels pretty incredible. Right from the moment you put it in your hands, it feels solid and sturdy, and it gives you a confidence to play the games hard and do your best. I mentioned in my initial review that the original Arcade1Up yoke was great, but the only downside was I was concerned about its long-term durability, but I am happy to say I have no concerns from the GRS yoke. When you start playing the game itself, you can tell that there is a noticeable upgrade in the quality of the buttons on the yoke. Both the trigger buttons and the thumb buttons have a very satisfying click to them and perform very well in gameplay, and I feel like I can fire faster and harder when going after TIE fighters during the opening dogfight stage. The yoke performs extremely well turning left and right, and the movement is fluid. There is also a really nice return to center feeling with the yoke, and you can be confident in your flying ability with it. One area where I do have a small critique is the XY axis controls on the flight yoke are really sensitive and a little light to the touch. This is both a blessing and a curse, as in stages like the dogfight and the tower run on the outside of the Death Star, I felt that this heightened sensitivity actually improved my gameplay, but when I got to the trench stage, I found it a little light for making my movements up and down. Of course, this yoke does not use gears, so it doesn't have the same tension as the original arcade yoke. I wish the tension was a little tighter, and the Arcade1Up yoke does provide a stiffer control in this area, but it's not a deal breaker by any means, and I'm sure that with enough playthrough, I will adjust to the new sensitivity. Again, I have limited experience with the original arcade cabinet, and the controls on that are probably more closely attuned to Glen's product, and people primarily used to playing the original will absolutely love the way it controls. I think that this is absolutely a much more improved product than the original yoke that was already great, but has the durability to last for your playing lifetime with the cabinet. Overall, I was extremely impressed with the quality of the Glen's Retro Show Flight Yoke, and certainly glad I changed it out. Is this a necessary mod to your Arcade1Up Star Wars cabinet? I don't know if I can say that it is, because the included stock yoke is actually pretty fantastic. However, if you want to improve your buttons and triggers, or if you're concerned about the durability of the stock yoke, or if you just wanted to buy a backup, or if you have a home build and wanted to add a yoke to it so you could play a ROM of Star Wars the arcade game, I can certainly recommend this one because the quality is second to none. I'll leave a link to Glen's Retro Show Amazon page so you guys can go and take a look and review the yoke for yourself and see if it's something you want to buy. It might say that it's out of stock currently, but I was talking to Glen and he's told me he's provided Amazon with 200 copies of the yoke, so there should be 200 available even if it says out of stock. Just keep checking back and you can pick one of these up for yourself. What I want to know now is, how many of you guys out there are interested in the Arcade1Up Star Wars cabinet? Do you already have an Arcade1Up Star Wars cabinet? And if so, what do you think of it? Also, what do you guys think of the Glen's Retro Show Flight Yoke? Is this a very cool add-on for your Arcade1Up cabinet? Are you interested, not interested? Or do you have a home build and you're looking to possibly add a flight yoke to that for a reasonable price? Let me know in the comments down below. I just want to take a minute to say thank you guys so very much for watching. I truly appreciate it. This is MichaelBtheGameGenie, and I'll talk to you next time.